Sarah sat at her kitchen table, the delicate sound of the kettle whistling in the background, her hands still gripping the letter that had arrived an hour ago. The embossed invitation was elegant, the golden script shining in the dim light of her small apartment. "You are cordially invited to the annual Blackwell Foundation Gala," it read, followed by the familiar name of the billionaire philanthropist who had built an empire on charity work. Adrian Blackwell. She hadn't heard that name in years, and yet, here it was, staring back at her like an unexpected ghost from the past. The gala was the event of the year, and for the wealthy elite, it was an opportunity to network, to flaunt their success, to be seen. For Sarah, it felt like an intrusion, a cruel reminder of a time she had long buried. The past she had worked so hard to escape, to build a life away from, was now forcing its way back into her life, this time in the form of an elegant invitation. She hadn't expected Adrian to be part of it. He had disappeared from her life as quickly as he had entered it, leaving behind memories, regrets, and more importantly, a daughter. Mia, her quiet, thoughtful little girl, had no idea who her father was. Mia didn't even know that her mother's heart still carried the heavy weight of that secret. Sarah's eyes scanned the invitation again, feeling the tension building in her chest. She hadn't been invited to an event like this before, nor did she ever imagine she would be. Adrian Blackwell was a household name, and his foundation was known for helping communities, providing scholarships, and funding medical research. He was a man who had everything: wealth, influence, and the power to shape the world. And then there was her, Sarah, a single mother, living paycheck to paycheck, barely keeping her head above water while raising a daughter alone. The invitation mocked her, a stark reminder of the life she had turned down and the promises that had been broken. Her thoughts drifted to the past, to the brief affair she had with Adrian all those years ago. It had been passionate, fleeting, and naive. At the time, she hadn't thought about the consequences of their night together. Adrian had been charming, confident, a man who could make any woman feel like she was the only one in the room. But it had never been serious, at least not for him. For Sarah, it was a brief escape from the life she knew, a temporary connection that in hindsight had been a mistake. And then came the pregnancy, unexpected, terrifying, and life-changing. She had chosen to keep Mia, to raise her on her own, away from Adrian's world of wealth and privilege. The sound of Mia's laughter broke Sarah's reverie, and she glanced toward the living room where her daughter played with her dolls. She had always protected Mia from the complexities of her past, from the man who was half of her. Sarah knew that revealing Adrian's identity to Mia was not something she could do lightly. It wasn't just about the man who had unknowingly fathered her. It was about Mia's future, her sense of self, and the stability Sarah had fought so hard to create for them. The invitation had arrived at a time when Sarah had finally begun to accept the life she had built. She had stopped longing for things that were out of her reach, accepting that this was her reality. She didn't need Adrian or his money. But as she stared at the letter, she couldn't deny that there was a small part of her that wanted answers. She had spent so many years buried in the day-to-day struggle of motherhood that she had never allowed herself to wonder what might have been, or what might still be possible. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her. Should she go? Should she show up at this extravagant event and face the man who had unknowingly changed the course of her life? The gala would be a chance to see Adrian again, to see how far he had come and what kind of man he had become. But more than that, it would give her the chance to finally confront him, to look him in the eye and tell him the truth that had been buried for far too long. Sarah hesitated. The thought of walking into a room full of influential people, feeling out of place and vulnerable, made her stomach churn. She knew she would be walking into a world she had never belonged to, a world that had left her behind the moment Adrian had walked away. But something told her that this might be the only chance she would get to say what needed to be said. Perhaps she had been carrying this secret for far too long. Finally, with a deep breath, she set the invitation down. She had never been one to run from difficult choices, and this time wouldn't be any different. She would go. She would face the man who had unknowingly fathered her child, and she would confront him with the truth. This was the moment. The past was no longer going to control her. Tonight, at the gala, everything would change. Mia's laughter filled the room again, but Sarah was no longer focused on the noise. She had made up her mind. The gala was no longer just an invitation to an event. It was the moment that would define their future. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now coming back, Sarah sat back in her chair, the memory of that night unexpectedly rising to the surface. It was a different time, one full of naivety and reckless decisions. She had been young, still figuring out who she was, and Adrian had been everything she wasn't. Confident, self-assured, a man who could walk into any room and command attention. When they first met, it wasn't anything out of the ordinary. She had been at a party thrown by a mutual friend, a casual gathering filled with laughter, loud music, and an almost tangible sense of freedom. Adrian was a part of that world, an orbit Sarah never really belonged to, but somehow she found herself pulled toward him. There was an instant connection, something that sparked between them the moment their eyes met across the room. He was charming, disarmingly so, with a way of making her feel like she was the only one who mattered. They spent the night talking about everything, nothing, and yet everything at once. She was captivated by his presence, his charisma, his ease with the world. He was the kind of man people wanted to be around, the kind of man who made you feel like you were part of something bigger. For a while, she let herself get lost in it. It was all too easy to fall into his arms. The night ended with a kiss, sweet at first, then deep, intense. And before either of them could second-guess the moment, they found themselves in his apartment, tangled in the sheets. It was spontaneous, thrilling, and in that moment, Sarah didn't think about consequences. She didn't think about the future. She only thought about the man in front of her, the way he made her feel alive, the way he made her forget everything else. For once, it was just about the now. But then the next morning came, and the reality set in. Adrian was distant, as if their night together had been just that, one night, a fleeting moment in his busy life. He had obligations, people to see, deals to close. Sarah woke up in his bed, the room still heavy with the scent of their intimacy, but she felt a shift. It was subtle, but unmistakable. He wasn't the same man from the night before. The warmth in his eyes had turned into something guarded, and the connection she thought they shared felt like it had never existed at all. As she dressed in a hurry, trying to leave without drawing attention to herself, Adrian barely looked up from his phone. He didn't offer a word of goodbye, just a brief smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It stung, but Sarah didn't let it show. She told herself it was just a fling, something that would fade into the background of her life, like all the other brief encounters she had had before. She left his apartment, her heart heavy, but determined to move on. Days turned into weeks, and as the silence between them grew, Sarah began to realize she hadn't really expected anything from Adrian. She had been caught up in the whirlwind of it all, in the excitement of being with someone who was so far removed from her everyday life. But when she found out she was pregnant, everything changed. The excitement, the thrill, the carefreeness, suddenly all of it felt irrelevant. This wasn't just about her anymore. Adrian had no idea. She hadn't told him, and she didn't know if she ever would. Her decision to keep the baby was hers alone, and telling him would complicate things in ways she wasn't prepared for. Adrian's life was filled with endless opportunities, high-profile events, and luxury she could never imagine. He had a future that didn't include a woman like her, a woman with an unexpected pregnancy and no real plan. She didn't want to be another name in his list of fleeting encounters, so she chose to keep it to herself. Months later, she realized she had made the right choice, even though it had been the hardest thing she had ever done. Mia was a joy, the light of her life, and as she looked down at her daughter now, Sarah knew that her decision was the right one. But a part of her still wondered, what would have happened if she had told Adrian? If she had reached out to him and told him he was going to be a father? Would things have been different? She shook her head, pushing the thought away. It was too late for what-ifs. But tonight, standing on the brink of that gala, Sarah couldn't help but wonder what would happen if she finally told him the truth. If she finally gave him the chance to know his daughter, to face the past they'd both left behind. Would Adrian's life change again? Or would it be too late? The memory of that night felt distant, like a story she had long ago told herself. But now, standing on the precipice of everything, it felt like that moment had led her here, to this moment, to this choice. The moment Sarah stepped into the grand ballroom, the weight of the world seemed to settle on her shoulders. The glimmering chandeliers overhead illuminated a sea of polished, designer-clad bodies, all moving with purpose and poise. The floor was sleek, a perfect reflection of the opulence that filled the room. Every detail screamed wealth, gold, silver, and glass reflected in every surface. The Blackwell Foundation Gala was an event designed to show just how powerful wealth could be, how it could change lives, and how it could unite the most influential people in the world. But Sarah, standing in the threshold of the room, felt like an outsider, someone whose presence would be lost among the glittering elite. She adjusted her dress, a simple, understated black gown that seemed far too modest for the extravagance of the room. She had chosen it deliberately, not wanting to draw attention to herself, not wanting to be seen. But now, surrounded by people whose lives were defined by their social status, she felt out of place. She tried to steady her breathing, to ignore the sting of insecurity that flared within her. She had never been part of this world. It was a world where people used their wealth to sway opinions, to control outcomes, to shape futures. And she, Sarah, was a woman who had spent years making ends meet, keeping a roof over her and Mia's head, and trying to hold on to the fragments of a life she had chosen to live outside of the spotlight. As she walked through the crowd, her eyes instinctively found Adrian. He was exactly as she remembered, and yet completely different. The man she had briefly known was no longer visible. Instead, he was a towering figure, surrounded by admirers and colleagues. He was the epitome of success, his tailored suit, his confident smile, the way people gravitated toward him. He was an architect of this world, the very center of everything that had once seemed so alluring to her. Sarah couldn't help but watch him, her pulse quickening as memories flooded back. Adrian had always known how to command attention, how to make every moment seem important. He had an air of effortless charm, a natural charisma that drew people in. Now, however, that charisma was tempered by a layer of distance. He wasn't just charming. He was untouchable, larger than life. She wanted to stay in the shadows, to stay unnoticed, but her legs betrayed her, carrying her closer to the epicenter of the evening. The whispers of the crowd, the laughter, the clinking of champagne glasses, all seemed like distant sounds as she approached the heart of the event. Sarah couldn't decide whether the atmosphere was suffocating or exhilarating. People milled around, exchanging business cards, discussing potential investments, and socializing in a way that felt so foreign to her. They spoke in terms of money, how much they had, how much they gave, and how much more they planned to accumulate. Their conversations were punctuated by the flicker of expensive watches and the shine of diamond-studded cufflinks. She took a deep breath and forced herself to focus. This wasn't about the people around her. It wasn't about the glamour. It was about Adrian, the man who had unknowingly fathered her child. It was about the moment she had come here for. She didn't know what she expected, but the more she observed, the more she realized how much the man she once knew had changed. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was an icon, a symbol of everything she had chosen to walk away from. And now, standing in the midst of all this opulence, she had to confront him. As she drew closer, her heart started to race. She could feel the weight of the truth pressing against her chest, threatening to burst free at any moment. The image of Adrian, so poised and controlled, made her own uncertainty feel all the more real. How would he react when she told him? Would he be surprised? Angry? Would he even care? The people around Adrian seemed to hang on his every word, their faces lit with admiration. He was speaking passionately to a group of investors, gesturing with his hands as he discussed his latest philanthropic projects. Sarah couldn't help but notice how effortless it seemed, how natural he was in this world, this space that had once seemed so far removed from her. There was no trace of the man she had known, the man who had made her feel like she was the most important person in the room, even if it was just for one night. But it wasn't the man she had once known that mattered anymore. It was the father of her child. She glanced down at the invitation she still clutched in her hand, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. This was her moment. The world Adrian had built with his name, his wealth, and his influence was all here, spread out in front of her, but it was nothing compared to the truth she carried with her. And now, standing among the glittering crowd, she realized it wasn't about his wealth or power. It was about the past they shared, about the child he didn't even know existed. As Sarah continued to move through the room, trying to gather her thoughts, she was almost struck by the sheer scale of it all. Adrian's life, the one he had so effortlessly built, was in stark contrast to hers. She had spent the last few years focusing on keeping Mia safe, on providing her with love and stability, not considering the possibility of this world ever intersecting with hers. But tonight it was unavoidable. Sarah knew she could no longer stay in the background. She couldn't pretend that Adrian wasn't a part of their lives, even if he didn't know it. Adrian's laughter reached her ears, and she looked up to see him shaking hands with a prominent donor, his face lit with the kind of smile that had always been magnetic. His success, his power, his world, it was all here. And in that moment, Sarah realized she wasn't just about to confront a man from her past. She was about to confront everything she had walked away from. The wealth, the glamour, and the life she could have had but chose not to. With a deep breath, Sarah steeled herself. She had come here to face him, and now, more than ever, she knew that this was the moment everything would change. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she stood just a few feet away from Adrian. She had been circling him in the room for what felt like hours, watching him laugh, smile, and talk with ease, completely unaware of the life they had once shared. It was surreal. This man, this stranger before her, was the same person who had once made her feel alive in a way she never thought possible. And now, she was about to shatter that illusion, to tell him something that would change everything. The noise of the gala swirled around her, the clinking of glasses, the soft hum of conversations, the music playing in the background. But all she could hear was the sound of her own breath. It felt like the entire room was holding its breath along with her, suspended in that one moment of choice. She could feel the tension building, the moment that had been coming for years, and it was now inescapable. Adrian was standing near a group of donors, his face animated as he discussed his latest charitable project. He looked the same, tall, confident, charismatic, but with a layer of detachment that Sarah hadn't expected. The man she remembered had been intense, fully present in every moment. This Adrian, however, was surrounded by people, speaking in polished tones, his words carefully measured. She knew this was the version of him that had made it to the top. This was the Adrian who had mastered the art of control, of being seen, of appearing untouchable. But Sarah wasn't interested in the version of him that the world saw. She wasn't even sure if that version of him ever existed for her. What she wanted was the truth she had carried alone for so long. She took a deep breath, her hands clammy, and stepped forward. The movement was automatic. She didn't give herself the chance to rethink it. She was standing in front of him now, and for the first time in years, their eyes met. Adrian's smile faltered for a brief moment, as if he wasn't quite sure what to make of her sudden presence. His eyes flickered with recognition, but quickly shifted back to politeness, the mask he wore with everyone else. "Sarah," he said, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "I didn't expect to see you here." Her throat tightened at the sound of his voice. It was the same voice, the same man, and yet the words felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she watched him, searching for the remnants of the man she had once known. But there was nothing there now. He was just another person in a sea of faces. His world, his empire, had swallowed him whole. "Funny," she finally managed, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her chest. "I didn't expect to be here either." Adrian raised an eyebrow, a slight smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "You're here now. I hope that means you're ready to enjoy the evening." He gestured vaguely at the crowd, the event, the entire world that seemed so far out of her reach. But she wasn't here for the event. She wasn't here to enjoy anything. Sarah swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her decision pressing on her. This was it. There was no going back. "I didn't come for the event, Adrian," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I came because there's something you need to know. Something I should have told you years ago." The words hung between them, heavy and undeniable. Adrian's face shifted slightly, the casual mask slipping for a moment. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his tone more serious now, though still tinged with that ever-present veneer of politeness. Sarah's eyes locked with his, and in that moment, she realized how much time had passed since they had been truly honest with each other, since they had shared anything real. "You don't know me anymore, Adrian," she continued, her voice trembling with something between anger and sorrow. "But you should. You should know who I am. And more importantly, you should know that you have a daughter. Mia, she's your daughter." The silence that followed felt like it lasted an eternity. Adrian's eyes widened, and for a moment, he didn't speak, didn't move. His expression faltered, as if he didn't quite understand what she had just said. "What?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the confusion clear in his gaze. "Mia," Sarah repeated, her heart racing. "She's yours. She's our daughter. I didn't come here for your money or your world. I came because you need to know. She's been living without you, Adrian, and it's time you knew the truth." For a moment, Adrian just stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. His eyes darted to the people around them, as if looking for an out, an explanation for why she was saying this. But there was no escaping it now. The truth was out in the open, as raw and real as the pain it had caused her over the years. Adrian's gaze flickered back to Sarah, then down to the floor, his jaw clenching as he processed the words. "I don't." He paused, clearly struggling with what to say. The usual charm that had always come so easily to him had vanished, replaced by something much darker. Something Sarah couldn't place, but knew was there. "I didn't want you to be a part of this life," Sarah said, her voice more fragile now. "But Mia deserves to know her father. I don't need anything from you, Adrian. I've built a life for us without you. But she deserves the truth." Adrian opened his mouth, but nothing came out. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words and emotions neither of them knew how to handle. The world around them felt distant, muted as the reality of the moment settled over them both. The man she had once loved, the man who had no idea he was a father, now stood in front of her, a stranger with the weight of a past he never even knew existed. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The truth had been laid bare, and now, the world they had built around themselves, Sarah, with her daughter, and Adrian, with his empire, had collided in a way neither could have expected. Finally, Adrian found his voice, but it wasn't the one that had charmed rooms full of people. It was quiet, almost broken. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I couldn't," Sarah replied, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I thought you'd never want to know. I didn't want her to grow up with false hopes. I didn't want to be just another chapter in your life." Adrian stood there, motionless, as the weight of her words sank in. The silence between them stretched, each of them grappling with the enormity of what had just been revealed. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes, and no way to undo the years that had been lost. But for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like the truth had finally been spoken. And whatever came next, she knew it had to be done. The world would never be the same, but at least it was real. At least now, there was no more hiding. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now coming back, the silence between Sarah and Adrian lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. The words Sarah had just spoken hung in the room like a thick fog, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Adrian's face was unreadable, his jaw tight as he processed what Sarah had just revealed. It was as though the ground beneath them had shifted, and they were standing on unstable ground, unsure of what would come next. The music from the gala, once lively and upbeat, now seemed distant, as though the world outside had ceased to exist. It was just the two of them, caught in the whirlwind of a truth neither of them had ever anticipated. The room around them had started to take notice. Whispers rippled through the crowd, and Sarah could feel the eyes of the guests burning into her back. She had never felt more exposed. Adrian's public image was flawless. A billionaire philanthropist, the face of every major charity event, admired by everyone in this room. But now, in the span of a few minutes, that image was cracking. People were talking, and Sarah could hear bits of their conversation, snippets of disbelief. "Did you hear that?" someone murmured. "He's got a child? With her?" The words stung more than Sarah had expected. She had always imagined what it would be like to confront Adrian, to finally let him know the truth about Mia. But she hadn't anticipated the spectacle it would become, the judgment from people who had no idea about the struggle she had faced raising her daughter on her own. Adrian's lips parted, but no words came out. He blinked several times, clearly stunned, as if he couldn't quite process the reality of what he had just learned. The confident, polished facade he had worn throughout the evening was gone, replaced by something that resembled panic. His hands trembled slightly, betraying the calm exterior he had cultivated over the years. "You're telling me she's really mine?" Adrian finally asked, his voice low, filled with disbelief. His eyes searched Sarah's face, as if he expected some sort of explanation, some reason for why she had kept this from him for so long. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked again, his voice tinged with frustration. Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had expected this reaction, but it didn't make it any easier to face. She had spent years coming to terms with her choices, but seeing Adrian's shock and confusion made the old wounds resurface. "I didn't want to complicate her life. I didn't think you would care," she said, her voice tight. "You have your own world, Adrian. I didn't want to be just another thing for you to manage." Adrian seemed to struggle with her words, as though they didn't sit well with him. "But I have the right to know." His voice rose, and some of the cool composure he usually had began to slip. He glanced around the room, as if searching for answers or some kind of escape from the reality of the situation. "Why didn't you give me the chance to be involved?" "I didn't think you would want to be," Sarah replied, her own voice quieter now. "You're not a part of this life. You've never been a part of it. I've raised Mia alone, Adrian. I didn't want her to grow up with a father who wasn't there, who wouldn't show up when she needed him." Adrian's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might say something more, something sharp, something defensive. But instead, he looked at her with a mixture of guilt and anger, as if he couldn't decide which emotion was more fitting. The awkward tension between them deepened, but Adrian's gaze never left her. "I didn't know, Sarah," he said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "I didn't know." Sarah couldn't help the bitterness that rose in her chest. "Of course you didn't know," she muttered. "You didn't even care enough to find out. You were too busy with your empire, your world." Adrian recoiled, his face flushing with anger. But there was something else there, too, a deep, gnawing regret. "That's not fair," he shot back. "You're blaming me for everything now, but you didn't even give me a chance. You cut me out of her life without ever telling me she existed. I didn't know, and now you're saying it's all my fault." For a moment, Sarah was taken aback. She had never truly expected Adrian to accept responsibility, to take any blame. But his words stung nonetheless. "I did what I thought was best," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I wasn't going to put her through something that complicated. She didn't need a man who didn't even know how to be one. She needed stability, not your guilt." The words hit Adrian harder than she'd anticipated. He seemed to deflate a little, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the situation was finally settling in. He was the one who had always been in control, the one who dictated the narrative. But now, faced with a truth he hadn't seen coming, the cracks in his perfect world were widening. "I'm not asking you to give me her whole life, Sarah," Adrian said, his voice much quieter now. "But I want to be a part of it. I want to be a part of hers. I've made mistakes, I know that. But I want to try. For her. For you." Sarah didn't know what to say. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times in her head, and yet, now that it was happening, she didn't know if she was ready for it. Adrian's words felt like a promise and a threat all at once. A promise that he wanted to be a father, but a threat that their carefully constructed lives might unravel in the process. The reality of the situation began to settle on Sarah's shoulders, the weight of it pressing down on her. The world around them had continued to spin, but for Sarah and Adrian, everything had changed. The gala, once a grand celebration of wealth and success, now felt like a reminder of everything they had lost and everything that could still be lost. Adrian turned away from her for a moment, looking out over the room. His eyes seemed distant, almost haunted. "I don't know how to fix this," he said almost to himself. "I don't know how to make up for everything I've missed." Sarah looked at him, her chest tightening. "I don't know if you can," she said softly. But that's not what matters right now. What matters is that Mia has a right to know who you are. She has a right to see you, to know her father. What you do with that is up to you." The weight of her words hung between them, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. They were two people bound by a past neither of them had expected, standing at the precipice of a future that was uncertain, tangled, and fragile. The fallout had only just begun, and Sarah wasn't sure if either of them would be ready for what was to come. But one thing was certain: their lives would never be the same again. Adrian stood there for a long moment, staring at Sarah, his mind reeling with what she had just revealed. The words she had spoken were still echoing in his ears, but they didn't make sense. He had spent his life building an empire, shaping his future, always knowing where he was headed, always in control. And yet, here he was, standing in the middle of a gala, surrounded by people who admired him, respected him, completely unaware of the bombshell that had just been dropped in front of him. He didn't know what to feel. The reality of being a father, of having a daughter, wasn't just surprising, it was terrifying. Adrian had always prided himself on being careful, calculated, able to manage every aspect of his life with precision. But this was a mess, something he couldn't plan for, couldn't fix with money or influence. It was raw, it was personal, and it was his responsibility. He could feel the weight of Sarah's gaze on him, the silence between them almost suffocating. It was as if the whole room had closed in around him, the noise and the laughter fading into nothingness. His mind raced as he tried to piece together what he had just learned. Mia, his daughter. How had he missed this? How had he not known? The thought that he had been walking around all these years, living his life, while she had been growing up without him, it felt like a punch to the gut. His chest tightened as he tried to swallow down the wave of guilt that threatened to overtake him. "What am I supposed to do now?" Adrian finally asked, his voice hoarse, a mix of frustration and disbelief. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture almost mechanical. His eyes searched Sarah's face, desperate for some kind of explanation, some way to make sense of this chaotic new reality. "How could you keep this from me, Sarah? Why didn't you tell me sooner?" His words were sharp, and there was an edge to his voice that surprised even him. He hadn't meant to sound accusatory, but the confusion and guilt were clouding his judgment. All of this, everything that had been kept from him, had happened behind his back. His mind kept returning to that one question: why didn't she reach out to him? Why didn't she give him the chance to be a father? Sarah's eyes softened as she met his gaze, and for a brief moment, Adrian saw the pain he had caused her. The walls she had built around herself were now clear to him. "I couldn't trust you, Adrian," she said quietly, her voice trembling with emotion. "I didn't want her to grow up in a world where you were just another name, another empty promise. I didn't want her to feel the way I did." Adrian's stomach twisted as her words hit him harder than he expected. He hadn't thought about it like that, about the way Sarah had been forced to navigate her life alone, carrying the weight of a decision he had never even known about. The guilt settled deeper within him. He had been too caught up in his own success, his own image, to even consider the consequences of his actions. He had been living a life where everything was planned, everything had its place, but Mia, his daughter, had never been part of that picture. "I didn't know," Adrian muttered, his voice breaking slightly. He hated how weak he sounded, how unprepared he felt for the conversation they were having. "I didn't know, and now I don't know what to do." Sarah stood there, watching him with a mixture of sympathy and resolve. "It's not about what you can fix, Adrian. It's about what you're willing to do now. She deserves to know who you are, who her father is. She deserves the truth, whether you're ready for it or not." The harshness of her words stung, but Adrian knew they were true. He had spent his life making decisions based on what would benefit him, what would propel him forward in his world of power and wealth. But this was different. There was no blueprint for this, no guide to tell him how to become the father he had never been. He felt like a stranger to the idea of parenthood. The guilt felt like a weight in his chest. But it was the confusion, the sheer uncertainty of what came next, that consumed him. "I never wanted to hurt you," Adrian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted this to happen, but I can't undo the past." Sarah's expression softened, but there was still a hardness in her eyes. No, you can't. But you can do something now. For her. For Mia. Adrian took a step back, feeling like he needed space to think, to process. He looked around the room at the faces of people who had no idea what was unfolding between them. To them, Adrian Blackwell was untouchable, a man who could do no wrong. But here, with Sarah in front of him, he realized how far from perfect he was. His reputation, his wealth, none of it mattered now. Mia mattered, his daughter mattered, and he had no idea how to be the father she deserved. The realization hit him harder than any business deal or negotiation ever had. His life, which had always been about control, was now completely out of his hands. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't know what to do. Adrian met Sarah's gaze again, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt, frustration, and something else. Something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Vulnerability. I don't know if I can be the father she needs. I don't know if I'm enough, he admitted, his voice heavy with the weight of his self-doubt. Sarah didn't flinch at his words. She simply nodded, as if she had expected him to say it. I'm not asking you to be perfect, Adrian. I'm asking you to try, to show up. That's all she needs. And that's all I need. Adrian stood there, feeling the shift inside him, like something was breaking open. He wasn't sure what he was capable of, or if he could ever make up for the years he had lost. But in that moment, he knew one thing. He had to try. For Mia. For Sarah. For himself. Okay, he said, his voice quiet but resolute. I'll try. I don't know how, but I'll try. The words felt too small for the weight of the situation, but they were the only ones he had to offer. And for the first time, Adrian didn't feel like he had to control everything. For the first time, he understood that trying, really trying, was enough. Sarah stood there, her mind racing as she watched Adrian's face, still processing the weight of the moment. The chaotic emotions swirling inside her felt like a storm that threatened to break free. She had always been so careful, so protective of Mia, and now, in the face of Adrian's revelation, that instinct kicked in harder than ever. Adrian's desire to be involved in Mia's life, to be a father, was clear, but something inside her resisted. The past years of raising Mia on her own, of carefully crafting a life filled with stability and love, had been hard-earned. She wasn't ready to let anyone, least of all Adrian, walk into that world without careful consideration. Mia had always been her anchor, the reason Sarah had fought so hard for everything she had. When Adrian's name had been nothing more than a distant memory, Sarah had still found ways to make life work, to build a sense of normalcy and security. But now, in this moment, with the truth exposed and the reality of what Adrian represented pressing in on her, Sarah couldn't help but wonder, was this really the right choice? Could she allow Adrian into their lives, knowing how much chaos, how much hurt he had caused just by not being there? She had worked so hard to make sure Mia never had to question who was there for her, to ensure she always had what she needed emotionally, even if there were days when money was tight or exhaustion weighed her down. The truth was, Sarah had grown used to being enough. She had built a life, small as it was, around her daughter, one that didn't need Adrian or the world he inhabited. It wasn't that she had resented Adrian for not being there. It was more that she had accepted his absence as a reality she could never change. She had adapted, made peace with it, and learned to rely on herself. But now, standing here, feeling the weight of Adrian's eyes on her, asking for something she wasn't sure she could give, Sarah found herself torn. What would it mean for Mia to have Adrian in her life now? What would it mean for Sarah, who had spent so many years protecting her daughter from the complexity of having a father who hadn't shown up? Could she really let Mia grow up knowing someone who had lived a life so far removed from the one she had built? As much as Sarah wanted to protect her daughter from the hurt, she couldn't deny the pull of responsibility she felt. Mia had a right to know the truth, to understand who her father was, and maybe, just maybe, it would be better for Mia to learn it from Sarah. The idea of keeping her in the dark any longer didn't sit right with her. But the prospect of letting Adrian back into their lives felt like opening a door she wasn't sure could ever be closed again. Adrian, Sarah started, her voice softer now, tinged with the vulnerability she rarely showed. I don't know if it's the right time. I don't know if you're ready to be what she needs, Her words caught in her throat, and she felt the sting of uncertainty, the nagging fear that maybe she was making the wrong choice, that maybe she was protecting Mia for too long, sheltering her from the truth for no reason other than fear. Adrian's face softened, a flicker of understanding crossing his features. He took a small step toward her, but she held up her hand, stopping him. "I've raised her alone, Adrian," she continued, her voice trembling just slightly. "It's been just the two of us. I don't know if I can trust you with her now, not after everything. I can't bring someone into her life just because it's what you think she needs. She's not a project or something you can fix. She's my everything, and I can't risk her heart being broken because I made the wrong decision." Adrian's expression faltered, but he didn't argue. He knew better than to press her too hard. Sarah's fears weren't unfounded. He had no idea what it was like to raise a child on your own, to carry the weight of all the responsibility and the love that came with it. He didn't know how it felt to protect a child from a world that could be unforgiving. All he knew was that he wanted to be a part of it, her life, Mia's life. But how could he ask Sarah to trust him when he hadn't been there for all those years? How could he ask her to let him in when he wasn't sure if he even knew how to be the kind of father Mia needed? "I understand," he said quietly, his voice tinged with guilt. "I'm not asking you to just hand her over, Sarah. I'm not asking you to let me fix everything. But I want to be there. For her. For you. I know I've missed a lot, but I want to try, even if I don't know what I'm doing." Sarah took a deep breath, her mind swirling with the enormity of what Adrian was offering. It wasn't a promise of perfection, but a tentative offer of something she had never really considered. Help, support, and maybe, in time, something resembling a father-daughter relationship. The weight of it all was so much to carry at once. How could she even begin to navigate this new reality, where Adrian was suddenly a part of the picture again? How could she trust him not to hurt Mia? Not to hurt her. She glanced over at Mia, who was still playing in the corner, oblivious to the heavy conversation unfolding between her mother and the man who had once been a part of their lives. Sarah watched her daughter for a long moment, the sight of her innocence making her heart ache. Mia deserved the truth, the stability, and the love that came with it. But did she deserve the pain that might come with it as well? "I don't know what it looks like yet," Sarah said softly, turning back to Adrian. "But if you want to be a part of her life, you have to prove it. It's not just about being there. It's about showing up when it matters. Not just for her, but for me. We've been doing just fine without you. I can't promise you anything, Adrian. I can't give you what you think you deserve, but I'm willing to let you try." There was a long pause, and Adrian nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "I'll prove it. I swear I'll prove it." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and uncertain. Neither of them knew what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she was taking a step forward, no matter how small. She wasn't sure where this new path would lead, but for Mia, for her daughter, she had to try. And maybe, just maybe, Adrian could be part of that future. But one thing was certain, she would never stop protecting Mia, no matter what. Before moving forward, do not forget to subscribe and share. Now, coming back, Adrian's attempts to rebuild trust with Sarah, and more importantly, with Mia, were far from easy. At first, it felt like walking on a tightrope, one step forward, two steps back. He had no guidebook for this, no clear path to follow. There were no rehearsed lines or perfect moments. Each interaction felt raw, vulnerable, and full of uncertainty. He started small, offering his time. He knew that actions, not words, would be what mattered most to Sarah. For weeks, he made sure to show up, even when it felt uncomfortable, even when it felt like Mia didn't fully understand what was happening. He would drop by their apartment, his face carefully composed, but with a deep sense of hesitation. Mia was always polite, but there was an aloofness to her. She didn't know him. She wasn't sure if she even wanted to. Adrian was used to being admired, to having people look up to him, but with Mia, all he had was time and patience. Two things he was starting to learn were harder to give than anything else he had built in his life. He would bring her small gifts, a new set of paints for her latest art project, books with characters he thought she might like. At first, Mia didn't seem particularly interested in them, though she would smile politely and say thank you. Adrian could feel the distance between them, a wall he couldn't quite break down. Sarah, too, remained cautious. She watched him closely, her eyes never fully trusting, even when she allowed him to be around. She didn't say much, but the unspoken boundaries were clear. One Saturday afternoon, Sarah left to run errands, and Adrian took the opportunity to spend some one-on-one time with Mia. He'd asked her what she wanted to do, and after a long pause, she finally shrugged and said, "I don't know. I guess we could paint." Adrian was relieved she'd chosen something simple. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do or say, but painting? That he could handle. He watched her carefully as she set out her art supplies, her eyes focused on the blank page in front of her as she picked up her brushes with quiet determination. Adrian sat beside her, awkwardly holding his own brush, unsure of how to begin. "I've never really painted before," he said, trying to break the silence. Mia glanced at him, offering a half smile before returning her attention to her work. "What are you painting?" he asked, attempting to sound interested. "Something about a bird." "It's not finished," she replied, her voice soft, almost hesitant. Adrian looked down at the painting in front of her, a series of abstract shapes that, when pieced together, almost looked like a bird in flight. It was raw, imperfect, but undeniably beautiful in its simplicity. He admired it silently for a moment. "It's really good," he said genuinely. Mia didn't respond immediately. Instead, she dabbed at her canvas, her brow furrowed in concentration. "You should just do whatever. It doesn't have to be good," she said, not looking at him. Adrian smiled softly at her words. He didn't know if she was talking about the painting or about their situation, but it didn't matter. They both knew it wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be perfect. But there, in that moment, he felt like he was finally starting to make a small connection. It wasn't much, but it was real. As the afternoon wore on, they painted in silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Adrian didn't push for more conversation. He just let the quiet fill the space between them. And that was enough. When Sarah returned, she found the two of them sitting side by side, the small living room littered with unfinished canvases and paint splatters. "How did it go?" Sarah asked, leaning against the doorframe with an eyebrow raised. "Fine," Adrian said, shrugging slightly. "We painted. I'm not sure it's art, but it's something." Sarah looked from him to Mia, and for the first time, there was a hint of approval in her eyes. It wasn't much, but Adrian knew it was something. He had spent the past few weeks trying to navigate Sarah's boundaries, trying to prove he could be trusted, but this was different. It wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping promises. It was about moments like these, the quiet ones, the ones where he simply showed up and let Mia see who he really was. Not the billionaire, not the businessman, but just a man who was trying to be part of her life, even if he wasn't entirely sure how to do it. That evening, Adrian decided to step up his attempts. He volunteered to help Mia with her homework, a subject he wasn't particularly good at. He could feel Sarah's eyes on him, watching, scrutinizing. She was still unsure, still guarded, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she busied herself with something else, allowing him the space to try. Mia was quieter than usual, but she didn't resist. Adrian didn't push her to talk. He simply sat beside her, offering gentle encouragement, trying his best to create a space where she felt comfortable. As the weeks went by, there were small victories, little moments when Mia started to trust him. She would ask him for help with her science projects, and even though he had no idea how to solve them, he would sit with her and try. They started sharing quiet conversations, not about anything profound, but about silly things. What the weather would be like tomorrow, the best pizza place in town, what book she was reading. It wasn't much, but for Adrian, it was a breakthrough. The walls that had once seemed so impenetrable were beginning to crack. But despite these moments, there were still times when doubt crept in. Adrian would catch himself looking at Sarah, wondering if she was seeing him for who he was, someone who wanted to be there, wanted to make it work. But sometimes her eyes were distant, clouded with the weight of the years they had spent apart. And it hurt. He wanted to prove to her that he was different, that he could be someone she could rely on. But those old scars, the ones Sarah carried, were still there, just beneath the surface. Still, Adrian pressed on. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that Mia's trust wouldn't come overnight, that Sarah's guard wouldn't fall in a single moment. But he was learning, slowly but surely, how to let go of his need for control. For the first time in his life, he realized that being there, truly being there, was all that mattered. Not the money, not the reputation, just a simple act of showing up, of trying. And with each small gesture, each moment of honesty, he knew he was taking another step toward earning their trust. Whether or not he ever reached the finish line was still unknown. But for the first time, Adrian wasn't afraid to keep trying. Adrian had always been a man of control. He had spent his life building his empire, structuring every decision with meticulous care. His world was one of calculated risks and expected returns, where every move was planned, every outcome predictable. But as he sat in the quiet of his apartment one evening, staring at the half-finished painting Mia had left behind on their last afternoon together, he realized how little control he actually had in his personal life. His attempts to connect with Mia had been slow and uncertain, a series of awkward moments, tentative conversations, and uncomfortable silences. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted. He had begun to care, not just about the idea of being a father, but about Mia herself. He was learning not just about her likes and dislikes, but about the space he needed to give her, about how much time she required to trust him. Mia was still hesitant, still guarded, and Adrian couldn't blame her. How could she be expected to welcome him into her life when he had been a ghost for so long? There were days when he felt like he was barely scratching the surface, when every step forward felt like 2 steps back. He couldn't erase the years of absence with a few thoughtful gifts or well-meaning gestures. It wasn't enough to simply show up. What Mia needed from him was more than that. She needed him to be consistent, to prove to her that he wasn't going anywhere. But it was more than just Mia now. Adrian was beginning to realize the full extent of what he had missed, not just with her, but with Sarah as well. For years, he had been blind to the complexity of her life, her struggles, her sacrifices. When he had first learned that Mia was his daughter, he had been consumed by guilt and confusion, unsure of how to move forward. But as time passed, as he spent more moments with Mia and Sarah, something began to shift inside him. He started to see the world through their eyes. He saw the weight Sarah had carried, the years she had spent raising Mia alone, the quiet strength she had cultivated in the absence of his presence. Adrian couldn't pretend that he could fix everything overnight, that he could undo the mistakes of the past with a few heartfelt apologies. But the more he spent time with Sarah and Mia, the more he realized he didn't need to fix everything. What mattered was showing up, being present, being someone they could rely on, not just as a father, but as a person who was capable of changing, of growing. One evening, after another quiet dinner with Sarah and Mia, Adrian found himself standing by the window, looking out over the city. His mind was racing. He had started to recognize something about himself, something he had ignored for so long. He wasn't the same person he had been when he first walked into their lives. In the past, he would have solved the problem with a check, thrown money at it until it went away. But this wasn't something that could be solved with money or influence. It required something deeper, something he had never allowed himself to give before: vulnerability. He turned to look at Sarah, who was in the kitchen, washing the dishes. She was focused, her movements precise, but there was an exhaustion in her shoulders, a quiet weariness that Adrian had only just started to notice. Sarah was carrying the weight of their entire situation, trying to balance Mia's trust with her own skepticism of him. He knew it wouldn't be easy for her to let go of the walls she had built around herself, walls that had been forged over years of disappointment, of doing it all alone. Adrian had always been good at getting what he wanted, at manipulating situations to his advantage. But with Sarah, with Mia, that approach didn't work. They didn't need someone who was just interested in making things right. They needed someone who was willing to do the hard work, someone who was willing to put in the time and effort without expecting immediate results. And for the first time in his life, Adrian felt the shift inside him. He no longer wanted to just control his world. He wanted to be part of theirs. He walked into the kitchen, quietly, not wanting to startle her. Sarah looked up as he approached, her eyes tired but warm. She wiped her hands on the towel and stood there, waiting for him to speak. "Sarah, I'm sorry," he said, his voice soft, carrying a weight he hadn't intended. "I don't expect things to change overnight. And I know I've made mistakes, but I want to do better." For Mia, for you. I want to show you that I'm not just here because I feel guilty. I'm here because I want to be part of your lives. For real. Sarah didn't answer immediately, but he could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the hesitation that still lingered. She wasn't ready to completely let him in, but she wasn't shutting him out either. It was a slow, gradual process, but Adrian could feel the distance between them shrinking, even if just a little. I don't know how to be a father, Sarah, Adrian continued, his voice quieter now. But I'm learning, and I'll keep learning as long as it takes. She nodded, her expression softening slightly. That's all I need to hear, Adrian. But you're right. It's not about being perfect. It's about being consistent, showing up when it matters. In that moment, Adrian realized just how far he had come and how far he still had to go. He had always believed that he could fix everything with enough effort, enough resources. But now, he understood that the key to rebuilding trust wasn't in grand gestures or sweeping promises. It was in the small, everyday moments, the times he showed up for Mia, the times he listened to Sarah, the times he put in the effort without expecting anything in return. The days that followed were filled with quiet progress. Adrian didn't have all the answers. He still didn't know how to be the father Mia needed, or how to fully win Sarah's trust. But he was showing up, being present, taking responsibility for the role he had to play in their lives. And slowly, in his own way, he began to build something real with them. Adrian knew that his growth was just beginning. There would be more missteps, more awkward silences, more moments when he questioned whether he was doing the right thing. But for the first time, he wasn't running away from the discomfort. He was leaning into it, accepting that true growth didn't come from avoiding the hard parts. It came from facing them head on. And with each day, he felt a little more confident that, no matter what happened, he was finally on the right path. Not just to redemption, but to something deeper, a genuine connection with Mia, with Sarah, and with the kind of man he wanted to become. Sarah sat in the quiet of the evening, the soft hum of the city outside barely reaching her ears. Mia was already asleep, her room filled with the gentle sound of her steady breathing. Sarah found herself staring at the wall, lost in thought, the weight of the decision she had been avoiding for so long pressing heavily on her chest. It had been weeks since Adrian had come back into their lives, and in that time, Sarah had watched him try. He had made mistakes, yes, but there was something different about him now. She couldn't deny that. He was here, really here in a way that felt real, not just because it was what he thought he should do, but because he wanted to. But wanting something wasn't the same as being able to give it. She had learned that lesson the hard way. She had always been the one to take care of everything, the one to make sure Mia never felt the sting of abandonment. It was easier that way. It was safer. And for so long, Sarah had told herself that Mia didn't need anyone else. She didn't need Adrian, especially not a man who had left without so much as a word, a man who had only come back when it suited him. But as Sarah watched Adrian try, watched him struggle with his own guilt and confusion, something inside her began to shift. She wasn't sure when it had happened. Maybe it was when he had spent hours with Mia, trying to help her with homework, or when he showed up at her door with a simple bouquet of flowers just to say he was thinking of them. Maybe it was when he opened up to her in a way she hadn't expected, admitting how much he didn't know, how much he was still learning. That honesty, that vulnerability had caught her off guard, and over time, it had begun to chip away at the wall she had built. But there was still so much fear in her. The fear of being hurt again, the fear of trusting someone who had already broken her trust once. And it wasn't just about Adrian. It was about what she had built, what she had protected. She had created a world for herself and Mia that didn't need anyone else. She had gotten used to being the strong one, the one who could handle it all. It was hard to admit, even to herself, but letting Adrian in meant letting go of that control, letting go of the fear of losing everything she had fought so hard to create. Her mind kept returning to the simple truth. She wasn't ready to give her heart away again. Not fully. Not without knowing for sure that it was worth the risk. She had spent so long protecting Mia, protecting herself, and the idea of someone else becoming part of that world again felt both liberating and terrifying. Adrian wasn't just a man from her past anymore. He was a possibility for their future, and that was a lot to carry. As the evening wore on, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her had shifted. It wasn't a dramatic revelation. There was no clear moment where everything suddenly made sense. It was more like a quiet understanding, a realization that maybe, just maybe, she had been holding on to the past for too long. Adrian's efforts to be a part of their lives had been clumsy, at times, but they had been consistent. He had given her space, given Mia space, and let them decide how they wanted him to fit into their world. He hadn't pushed, and in that way, he had proven more than words ever could that he was here to stay. She thought about the moments they had shared, small, simple moments that had meant more than she'd realized. The quiet dinners when Adrian had taken the time to ask Mia about her day, his patience when Mia had been distant, the way he showed up for her in ways that no one had ever expected. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. Enough for her to start wondering if it was worth taking a chance. Enough to think about what it might look like if they tried, really tried, to build something together. When Sarah walked into the living room that night, Adrian was sitting on the couch, his expression unreadable as he scrolled through his phone. He looked up when she entered, his eyes locking with hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It was the kind of silence that was filled with everything unspoken, everything that had led them here, and everything they still had to work through. "I've been thinking," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady but filled with a vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself to express in a long time. "About us. About Mia. About everything." Adrian set the phone down, his full attention now on her. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly, as though afraid to disturb the delicate balance between them. "I've been holding back," she admitted, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I've been afraid to let you in, afraid that if I let you get close, it would all fall apart. But Mia deserves the truth, and I deserve to not live in fear anymore." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Adrian didn't respond. He just looked at her, as if weighing her words, as if understanding just how much it had taken for her to say them. Finally, he spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "I'm not going anywhere, Sarah. I'm here. I'm not asking for anything more than to be part of Mia's life, and yours, if you'll let me. I know I can't fix everything, but I'm ready to try. For you both." Sarah's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had heard them before, but now, in this moment, they felt different. They felt real. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, could feel the shift in the air between them. And for the first time in a long time, she realized she was ready to take a step forward, ready to open her heart again. Slowly, cautiously, but with a sense of hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "I'm scared," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I think we can try. Together. For Mia's sake, and for ours." Adrian nodded, a small, genuine smile spreading across his face. "We'll take it slow. We'll figure it out." In that moment, Sarah felt the walls inside her begin to crumble. The fear that had held her back slowly melting away. There would still be challenges, still be moments of doubt, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid to face them. She wasn't afraid of what the future might hold, because, with Adrian by her side, she knew they could build something real. Not perfect, but real. And that, she realized, was enough. She sat down beside him, her hand brushing his in a gesture of quiet connection. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt something she hadn't expected to feel: hope. The weeks that followed were filled with small, hesitant steps, but they were steps forward, and for Sarah, that was enough. Adrian's presence in their lives had become a part of their daily routine, but it wasn't rushed. It wasn't perfect. It didn't come with a timeline or a promise of things being instantly healed. But it was real. The awkwardness slowly faded as Adrian spent more time with Mia, not trying to force a connection, but allowing her to decide in her own time what that relationship could be. Mia had been distant at first, as Sarah had expected, but something shifted one evening when Adrian took Mia to the park. It wasn't anything grand, just a walk along the old stone paths, a moment of shared quiet, and a few tentative questions about her favorite books or her artwork. It wasn't the beginning of anything monumental, but it was a start. For the first time, Mia had smiled genuinely, a smile that reached her eyes, and in that smile, Sarah saw the potential for something more. A connection that wasn't forced, but one that had room to grow. Sarah watched it all from a distance at first. She kept her distance, not out of mistrust, but out of fear. Fear that she might be wrong about Adrian. Fear that opening her heart to him again would mean opening up to a new kind of heartbreak. But each day, each quiet gesture he made, chipped away at that fear. He was there, really there. He didn't just show up when it was convenient. He didn't just buy things or make empty promises. He spent time with Mia, helped her with schoolwork, and showed up for Sarah in ways she hadn't expected. He didn't try to be perfect. He simply tried to be present. That, in itself, was more than enough. It was on one of these quiet evenings, as the sun began to set and the sky painted itself with hues of pink and orange, that Sarah realized how much had changed. Adrian was sitting on the floor with Mia, helping her build a new Lego structure, while Sarah watched from the kitchen, her heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. It wasn't just about Adrian being there. It was about the family they were slowly, carefully becoming. It was about the warmth in their home, the laughter that filled the space, and the understanding that had quietly settled between them. She wasn't sure when it happened exactly. The moment when the fear faded into something else, when the hesitation became trust, when the walls she had spent so long building finally came down. But as she looked at Adrian and Mia, something inside her clicked. They were a family. They weren't the family she had once imagined, with all the pieces falling into place as easily as she had once hoped. But they were a family in their own way, imperfect, messy, and real. Adrian looked up from the floor, catching Sarah's gaze from across the room. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the weight of everything they had been through hung between them. Everything that had brought them to this moment, everything that was still uncertain. But there was no fear in his eyes now, no guilt, no pressure to be something he wasn't. Just a quiet understanding. An acknowledgement that this wasn't the end of their journey, but the beginning of something new. He smiled softly, a smile that held all the sincerity Sarah had been waiting for. "I'm glad you're here," he said, his voice low but full of meaning. Sarah's heart swelled in her chest, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was truly seeing him, really seeing him. Not the man from her past, not the image of a person she had built in her mind, but the man who had been trying, the man who was showing up, who was learning what it meant to be part of their lives. And the realization hit her with a quiet but powerful force. She had been afraid of opening her heart again because she was afraid of losing everything. But what she hadn't realized was that sometimes, in order to gain something, you had to take the risk of truly opening up, of letting someone in even when the past had been so painful. "I'm glad you're here too," Sarah whispered, the words carrying more meaning than she ever expected them to. She wasn't just saying it because it was what Adrian needed to hear. She was saying it because, in that moment, she realized how much they had both grown, how far they had come, and how much more they could become together. Mia looked up from her Lego creation, her eyes wide with a childlike curiosity. "Are we a family now?" she asked, her voice soft, as if she wasn't sure how to phrase the question but needed the answer. The question hit Sarah's heart like a punch, but it wasn't painful. It was beautiful and raw and so simple in its innocence. She smiled gently, walking over to where Adrian and Mia sat on the floor. She knelt down beside them, her hands resting on their shoulders. "Yes, Mia," she said, her voice steady, the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. "We are." Adrian's smile widened, and for a brief moment, Sarah saw the man she had once loved, soft, vulnerable, and full of hope. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But they had a chance now, a chance to create something new, to build a family not out of expectations, but out of the messy, beautiful reality of their lives. As they sat together, the three of them, Sarah felt something stir inside her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. It was hope, quiet and steady, like the first breath of spring after a long winter. She had always been afraid of what it might mean to open her heart to Adrian again, to trust him, to let him be part of their family. But as she looked at him, at Mia, she knew that this was the family they were meant to be, imperfect, unpolished, but real. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah wasn't afraid of what came next. This was their new beginning, not a perfect one, but one that was full of possibility. Together, they were going to figure it out. Together, they were going to be okay. I know you guys have already subscribed till now, but if you have not, do like, share, and subscribe.